So we're going to continue that Gemara, the Gemara of Sanhedrin, Perek Chelek, and that's what I want to do really, I guess, moving forward. This is a very important chapter in Talmud, Perek Chelek. It includes many stories with many profound ideas. So that's what we're going to be going through. Again, I'm not going to cover every part of the Talmud, but we'll jump around, not jump around, we'll skip parts, but we're going through chapter Chelek, which is chapter 11 of Sanhedrin. And last week, someone today asked if the classes are recorded. They are recorded, not only presented live, but also recorded on Zoom. You can access the Zoom recording. I'll direct you to Elia for that. Speaking of Elia, Mazel Tov to Elia, and L'chaim is being recognized by the local Detroit Jewish News as one of the rising stars in the U.S. of A. So L'chaim, or something like that. So L'chaim, to that great achievement, continue to do great work for the community and for Klal Yisrael. Chaim. Kiddush. Okay, now the last week's Gemara, we spoke about the story which is described in the book of Daniel, in which the three holy people of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah allowed themselves to be thrown into the fire instead of worshiping this giant image. And I say image because that's what it was. They are the ones who determined that it was an idol. Danny, I think your mother wanted to listen to the class. Oh, okay, fine. So they were thrown into the fire. If you recall last week, we said that they actually had a way out. This wasn't an act of sacrifice that they were halachically required to do. They went to the prophet of the time, Yecheskel, and they said, should we go or not? And he said, you shouldn't bow, but don't make a scene out of it. Maybe just don't show up. And they said, no, if we don't show up, you're right, we'll have saved ourselves and we will not have worshipped idols. But what's the message going to be? The message is going to be that all the nations of the world bow to the idol. And that's why we have to show up, and we have to show up and visibly not bow to the idols. And that's what happened. And then again, this is a quick review because it's one of the biblical stories we should be familiar with. And then as they push this a little forward. No, has to be as is. Okay. And then as they and then it says the king saw them and he demanded that they bow, and he gave them another chance to bow, which we said was connected to a deeper idea that he felt that if the Jews bow, then he will have eternal dominion, because he knew that the only force that could undo his power were Jews. And he also knew that the only way to remove Jews, the greatest weapon against Jews, something that Bilam understood in the Torah as well, is not the weapons of war, but the weapon of causing them to sin. And therefore he said, let me get them to sin. So therefore their lack of bowing, he understood not just as an individual threat, as an individual act against them, but as a threat to his dynasty. He gave them another chance, and they said no. At this point he became enraged. He asked that the fires be turned on to 7 times the heat of what it was beforehand, had them thrown in, and then they're thrown in, and behold, the fire was so hot that those who threw them in were killed. And then he looks out and he says, behold, I see. What did he see? Anybody remember? 4 people. He says, behold, I see 4 people walking in the fire, 3 people who we just threw in, and a 4th person who looks like an angel. And that's where the Talmud derived that from here you see humans are greater than angels. Humans can be greater than angels, because he said the 4th one is the angel, which means the first 3 were greater. The first 3 were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The 4th was the angel. And eventually they were taken out, and everyone saw the great Kiddush Hashem, and that back the way to some degree. This Kiddush Hashem backfired. The sanctification of God's name backfired because everyone looked at the Jews and said, you have such a great God, then how is it that only these 3 were willing to stand up and not bow? You see what a great God you have, and yet it was only 3 of you which lived with such self-sacrifice, and that's why it has a strange discussion about how they died. They died from spit, which we said really means an ayin hara. So that's what we spoke about last week. Yes, Danny.
Why didn't they try to
Why didn't they try to get more people involved?
Like we see with Noah, he should have saved more people. He didn't, right? So
Why didn't they recruit others to this?
Why not say we need to stand together as a united people and we're all not going to bow?
Right, right.
Just standing up as three people.
The way Mordechai did in the Purim story.
Humiliated and laughed at, but still, it just seems like there should have been some kind of collective effort.
You're right. That's an interesting question. Why didn't they recruit others to the same act of self-sacrifice? So I don't know offhand. Maybe based on what we said last week, that Yecheskel advised them just to stay away. So they felt we don't have to endanger the lives of others. We don't have to tell others to do what we're doing, which is clearly endangering our lives. But rather, for others, it may be sufficient if they just stay away. And that's why, it's one thing to be Moser Nefesh yourself, to give your own life up, even if you don't have to. In that situation, halachically, they didn't have to give their lives up, right? Apparently, it was an option because that's what Yecheskel advised them to do. And you're certainly in better shape in that circumstance by not going than showing up and standing.
The majority of Jews okay with it?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know, but the Gemara seems to indicate that a lot of Jews were happy bowing, and therefore and that's why these three made everyone else look bad. Now, if you think about it in life, are we supposed to withhold from doing something righteous because it'll make other people look bad? I don't think so. If you're in a situation where you're, there's somebody who's asking for help and nobody's doing anything. So should you say, well, I shouldn't help because it's going to make everyone else look bad? No. The answer is you do what needs to be done. But in this situation, the circumstances were such that it led to a great ayin hara against the Jewish people and against them. Fine. That's the story we spoke about last week. Now, yes.
What does it mean that it said the fourth one when it says first one tomorrow and the last day is when I know that that's not the right way to say it.
He could have said, I see four people. The question is, what does it mean he said the fourth one was? He could have said, I see four beings, and one of them looks like an angel. Even that would have been fine. But he says the fourth one, by emphasizing the fourth one, the Gemara says that's teaching us that he was the fourth in quality of those four. All right. So now the Gemara continues. This story, which we just shared, is maybe somewhat known. Some people know the story of Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. But now we're going to share what happens further within that story. It says, what happens next? So we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar was well known, even in non-Torah circles. Nebuchadnezzar was one of the great biblical, one of the great powers of all time. Move to the side, I can see you. All right, fine. So the Gemara says like this, that after Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were killed in the fire, there was another group of three people that was thrown into the fire. And the Talmud and the Pasuk talks about it. What's the story behind the next group of three that was thrown into the fire? And the results were quite different. The Gemara says that if you look in the prophet Yirmiyah was also from around that time. Yirmiyah, this whole story takes place in between the first and second temple, right? Daniel, the prophet Daniel, talk later if he's a prophet or not. Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Nehemiah, Yirmiyah. These are all the last group of prophets. And Yirmiyah is there for the destruction of the temple.
Yirmiyah is Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, correct. In Jeremiah, chapter 29, verse 21 and 22. And I'm right in the middle of 93a, for those who are following in the text. The prophet Yirmiyah gives the following prophecy. He says, Israel, 2 dots, middle of the page. This is what God of Israel says, El Achav ben Koliah, about a certain person named Achav, the son of Koliah. This is not King Achav. This is a different Achav. We have the King Achav, or in English is known as Ahab. This is a different Achav. Ahab was much earlier. The initial Achav was in the time of Elijah the prophet, many years earlier. This is a certain person named Achav, the son of Koliah, the El Tzidkiah ben Maasiyah, who is, and another person named Tzidkiah. So you have Achav and Tzidkiah. Says Yirmiyah, Hanavim lachem b'shmi l'shaker. These are prophets who are prophesying in my name falsely. God says to Yirmiyah, these two people, Achav ben Koliah, Tzidkiah ben Maasiyah, who are prophesying in my name falsely. And if you know Torah, you know Torah has a very harsh ruling about a Navi Sheker, a false prophet. Says the prophet Yirmiyah, "V'lukach mahem klala l'chol galos Yehuda." There will be a terrible. They will be cursed. Asher bebavel lemar. Going Yisimcha Hashem kitzidkiyo ke'achav. People will eventually come to say, when they want to curse others, says Yirmiyah, when people want to curse others, they will curse them by saying that you should be like Achav and Tzidkiah, Asher kala melech bavel ba'esh, that were roasted in fire. So somehow there's these two false prophets, one named Tzidkiyahu, one named Achav, who are going to be roasted in fire. By raise of hand, not to put anyone on the spot, is anybody familiar with this story before we read it? What about these two false prophets and what happened? Oh, good. Okay, good. I still have my job to teach this. I also was not familiar until I read this Gemara. So, what's the story? What is the story behind these two false prophets who were killed? Says the Gemara, I'm skipping a couple lines. Why was it that they were killed? So interestingly, it doesn't say because they were false prophets, but rather, Ya'an asher asu nivala b'Yisrael, because they did an immoral act among the Jewish people, vayina'afu es neshei re'ehem, and they committed adultery with the wives of their fellows. So these two false prophets not only were false prophets, but abused whatever power they had to commit acts of adultery. What did they do? So the Gemara says, "My avod." How did they commit their sinful behavior? Listen to this. They went right to the top. It says each of them who claimed to be a prophet went to the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Achav, the prophet, the false prophet Achav, Amar Allah, said to her, Koy Amar Hashem, this is what God said, Hishmieni el Tzidkiah. You should listen to Tzidkiah, my fellow prophet. In other words, Achav went and said, you should succumb to the, succumb to the advances of Tzidkiah, my fellow prophet. If he advances if he tries to convince you to sin with him, you should. That's what Achav said. The Tzidkiah Amar, and then Tzidkiah came and said a prophecy to her as well. Kol Amar Hashem, this is what God says. Hishmiyani al Achav. You should listen to what Achav wants. Whatever Achav wants, God says you should do. So here they basically conspired together. They realized if each one were to come themselves and say, God told me to sin, God told me to tell you to sin with me, then she'd be skeptical. Why? There's obviously self-interest. Instead, they each worked for one another. They used their power, but they also understood that if it was obvious abuse of power, it wouldn't work. So instead, they worked together to commit this type of sinful behavior. But they decided to try to seduce the daughters of Nebuchadnezzar. Wasn't a very wise choice in their part. Ozla, so this daughter, so she told her father what these prophets had told her. In her mind, these were prophets. And so said, Kol Amar Hashem, this is what God says. And she told her what he said. Amar Allah. So her father responded to her, Elokehem shel elu, the God of these people, the God of the Jewish people, Sone zimahu, hates immorality. The God of the Jewish people hates adultery, hates immorality. What they're saying just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. So here you have Nebuchadnezzar, someone who was the one who destroyed Jerusalem. And yet he also had an understanding of the God of Israel. And he says to his daughter, something is very wrong about it. Even though, each one is supposedly speaking in the name of God and advising you about their fellow prophet, this doesn't add up. He also legabach, and he said to her, next time they approach you, shadrinu legabai, send them to me. Send them to me. Fine. He also legabach, sure enough, they came back. Each one, I guess, individually. Shadartinu legabe avua, and she indeed sent them to her father. Amaluhu. So he said to them, he said, this is information my daughter has shared with me. I've been hearing about these interesting prophecies you're talking about. And he says, Man amalachun, who is telling you this? Who is telling you this prophecy? Amru, so they both said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God in heaven. Nothing we can do about it. This is what God says. We gotta share the prophecy. Let's remember, by the way, that just like there is a prohibition, a strong prohibition against a false prophet, there's also a strong prohibition against what's called kovesh es nevuas, which means withholding prophecy. Now, when a prophet hears something from God, they are forbidden to hold it back from the public, even if it's a troubling prophecy, even if it's going to make them unpopular. So they were using that as saying, look, we don't have a choice. This is what God says. We have to repeat that. So to which Nebuchadnezzar said, V'hachananya, Mishael, ve'Azariah. Remember, those three people who were the advisors to the king, who again we learned about last week. He said, those three, Shaltino, I asked them if this makes sense. I asked my Jewish advisors if it makes sense that God would convey such a message. V'amruli asur, and they said, no, it's absolutely forbidden. It cannot be that God would advise such a thing. Amrulei, to which these two, Achav and Tzidkiyahu, said, Anan nami nevi kvasai. We are prophets too. Why do you believe them over us? Liditu lo amalahu. To them, indeed, God would not give such a prophecy, but to us, God did give a prophecy. So this is how the dialogue went in the Nebuchadnezzar and these two prophets. All right. So now what? I mean, they're saying this is a prophecy. Nebuchadnezzar clearly was a spiritual person. I mean, he was a good person, but he certainly believed in higher powers and the idea of a God. So they said, this is our prophecy. Amalahu, he said, all right, if indeed you're claiming to be prophets as much or even greater than Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, Anaba'ina divdikinchu, then I'd like to test your strength. Ki kaninhu, just as I tested their strength. I tested them in their holiness, I'd like to test you the same way. Which means, just as I threw them into the furnace of fire and they survived, so too I'd like to test you the same way. So they weren't very excited about this. Amrulei. So at this point, these two Achav and Tzidkiyahu said, there's a problem. The problem is inun tlosen havu. They were three. There's a certain power and merit that three people have. The anan, train. Train in Aramaic is two. They were three. It could be that the reason that they were spared because they have the energy of three, they have the power of three. We're only two. So therefore, we don't know if we're going to be spared, and we don't think this test is a good idea. So that's what they said to Nebuchadnezzar. All right. So Nebuchadnezzar responded. Amalahu, he said, no problem. Bacharu l'choin, choose for yourself. Mam deba'isu ba'anaychu, whoever you'd like to be person number three, and the three of you all throw into the fire. He said, your problem that there's only two and not three. No problem. I'm giving you the option of choosing any third person you like, and that person will be the third for you. So now they knew that they weren't going to get out of this. So who was the third person they would choose? Amru. So they said, we are choosing Yehoshua Kohen Gadol. At that point, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was a man named Yehoshua, who was a very holy person, a very righteous person. So they said, we are choosing him as the third one there. Why? Why did they choose him? The Savri, they thought, Leisi Yehoshua, let us bring Yehoshua, the Nefish Zechuse, whose merits are very strong, Umagna Alon, and therefore he will protect us. The Mefarshim say, why didn't they choose some of the great people, some of the more famous people? Daniel. Daniel was himself was alive at the time, and they felt that Yeshua had the merit. Some of you may be familiar with this idea that every year on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol, it's actually appropriate, this week's Torah portion, we talk about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. So every year the Kohen Gadol would go into, once a year, on Yom Kippur would go into the Holy of Holies. But as you may know, if the Kohen Gadol was not worthy, then he wouldn't survive that event, because the power, the awesome power of that experience would kill them. So they looked at Yoshua and they said, Yoshua is someone who survives every year. He went into the Holy of Holies and has survived numerous times. So clearly he is able to withstand even challenging situations. So we feel Yehoshua, if we choose Yehoshua to be the third person to go along with us, then that's fine, then we'll be spared. So that's why they chose Yehoshua going up. Fine? Says the Gemara. Now I'm not exactly sure the timing on this. This may be before the destruction of the temple. I don't know. If you recall, in the Megillah, now we're already in other, we talk about Megillah. So we have, in the Megillah, it says, when we're introduced to Mordechai, in chapter 2 of the Megillah, it talks about a group of Jews who were exiled 11 years before the destruction of the temple. Anyway, so before the destruction of the temple, 11 years earlier, many of the great sages of Israel were already sent into exile. So it could be that this happened during those 11 years. Could be. And which would explain why Yehoshua is still a Kohen Gadol at this time. The temple is not yet destroyed. Anyways, they say, we'd like Yehoshua, Kohen Gadol, to be the third one. Says the Gemara, Achisuhu. So Nebuchadnezzar had Yehoshua brought down from Israel to Babel. Vishadinhu. And sure enough, he took the three of them, which is now Yehoshua, Tzidkiyahu, and Achav. He threw them into the fire. Inhu iklu. Sure enough, these two, Achav and Tzidkiyahu, were burnt and died because of that. V'Yoshua Kohen Gadol. Yeshua Kohen Gadol remained alive. He himself survived. So in other words, they felt that his merits would save him and they would be included in that merit. It didn't work that way. They died, he was saved. But it says, Gemara says, Ichruhi manai, but his clothing were burnt. He survived, but his clothing was singed. Shenemar, and this explains another verse. This is a verse in Zechariah, who says, the following passage of Zechariah, chapter 3, verse number 1 and 2. It says, Vayar'eni, and I saw, Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, says, and I saw, Es Yehoshua HaKohen HaGadol, I saw Yehoshua the Kohen Gadol, Omed Lifnei Malach Hashem, I saw Yeshua the Kohen Gadol standing in front of the angel of God, V'hasatan Omed Al Yemino L'sitno, and I saw, the verse states, and I saw Satan standing on his right hand side. And then the pasuk continues, Vayomer Hashem al Satan, and God said to the Satan, Yigar b'cha Hashem b'cha Satan, v'yigar Hashem abocha b'Yerushalayim halozeh. Behold, this one is ud mutzal miesh, like a, what would be an ud? An ud is a spark that is spared from the fire. Is ud a modern Hebrew word? A charcoal. Ud is charcoal? Interesting. Okay. So ud would be, he described Yehoshua as a charcoal which is removed from the fire. Is that the current Hebrew word? You don't know. Maybe not. But the point is, whatever an ud is, maybe it's charcoal, it is something that survives the fire, but is singed by the fire. Now, what's interesting is like this. We say, from here, this pasuk, even though this is not mentioned in this Gemara, we learn something very interesting. And that is, in Judaism, you have right and you have left. Kabbalistically, or forget about Kabbalistically, when you put on your shoes, which shoe should you put on first? Your right shoe. If you come to a fork in the road, Yogi Berra said that if you come to a fork in the road, take it. But in Judaism, if you come to a fork in the road and you have no idea which direction to go, which should you lean to do? The right. When you wash your hands, wash your right hand first. Why? Why do we show superiority to the right over the left? There's an exception. There are certain exceptions to that. Like when anything which has to do with tying, we do the left first, because that's the connection to the tefillin. Okay, that what? So you're saying it has to do with the sfirot. Chesed is you're saying chesed over gvura, kindness over severity. But where is the source that kindness is associated with right and severity is associated with left? Where do you have that? You're right. No, Sadia, your answer is right. It has to do with sfirot. Somehow right has to do with kindness and left has to do with severity. But where? Where in the Torah do you see that? If you look in the Torah, you won't find anywhere in the 5 books of Moses where it says clearly. We do have, I take that back. Where do we see in the Torah that the superiority of right over left?
I have to say, maybe the translation of right in Hebrew is sadak.
Right is sadak. That's right. So right, you're right. Atatzodek. So Elia pointed out that yes, we do see superiority of right over left in Torah, and that's with Menashe and Ephraim. That we say Yaakov switched his hands, and he put his right hand on the younger grandson, which is Ephraim, and he put his left hand on the older grandson. Yes.
Well, I kind of look at it like if God is a father, and your right hand to punish your son, so to say, and use your full out strength to hit him as hard as you can, or you can have kindness and not hit as hard as you could. And your left hand, the only time you're going to use your left hand, if you're in danger, you're going to hit as hard as you can at that moment. You know what I'm saying?
Right. That when you use your right hand, you shouldn't use your stronger arm to punish. Who's it?
Because you can back it up. It's able to control. The left hand, you're not going to be able to control as much. And it's not as
right.
easy to control how hard you hit.
Who's the great wrestler or fighter who said, the whole world's afraid of my left arm, and even my left arm is afraid of my right arm? Something like that. So you're saying a wrestler said that?
No, I don't know.
Oh, okay. So yeah, that makes sense. So anyways, you're saying that all right. So you're saying it has to do with the strength, that we should use our strength for kindness, and the weaker side should be used for toughness. Okay. These are all good, and they're all correct. But what's interesting is that this verse we just stated here, and I'll read it again, is one of the sources of the idea of choosing the right over the left. And even though it seems to be the opposite, the verse states, again, this is if you want to check this up on your own, Zechariah chapter 3, verse number 1 and 2. And Zechariah says, Prophet Zechariah speaking, I saw Yehoshua the Kohen Gadol, and Omed lefnei Malach Hashem, standing in front of a Malach, and the Satan was standing to his right, or on his right. From here we derive that the left side is connected to the Satan. Because Satan, let me finish this thought. Because the Satan is what is the Satan in Judaism? Here, Satan, right? I don't know, other faiths have this, Satan being some sort of power of evil. Judaism believes in Satan, but not in Satan as a power of evil. Satan literally means is basically a prosecuting angel. So Satan is prosecution, which is judgment. Now, the Satan is, the prophet says, I saw the Satan to the right of Yehoshua the Kohen Gadol. But when you see something to someone's right, if I'm looking at you right now and I see something to the right of you, which side is that to you? That's your left.
To the right of you.
If I see something on your right side, if I see something on your right, so I say on your right, if I see something to your right, there is, what I see is really your left. So from here we derive that the Satan, you want to know where the Satan stands? It's on your left. So the person who's looking at it sees it is looking, it's going to be to your right. But for you, it's to your left. So this becomes the source, one of the sources which is brought down halachically as to why right represents kindness and left represents severity. Because you see, when the Satan showed up, he was to Yehoshua the Kohen Gadol's left. The prophet saw him to the right because he was facing Yehoshua. And that's why, you see again, when you're facing someone, if you see something on the right side, it means it's their left, which means that if we are to almost think of ourselves in this term, on our right-hand side which again, you're looking at me, this will seem like the left. On my right-hand side, there is the angel of goodness. And on my left-hand side is the Satan, the angel of prosecution. And therefore, we lean to the right because we always want to lean towards the idea of kindness and not towards severity. Severity is not evil. Severity is not bad. Judgment is not. It just means that we want to lean towards the right-hand side. Now, there's exceptions on Pesach when we eat the matzah and we drink the wine, we lean to the left. Yes.
You mentioned that
Yaakov switched his hands, yeah?
pretty much less the New or the city.
Correct.
Which is exactly what happened with him.
He blessed Ephraim before Manasseh. Yeah. He blessed them together, but he gave Ephraim the stronger blessing.
Primary, like, default,
Yes, yes.
to
Supremacy.
the younger one.
Correct.
That's the reason why Yosef tried to fix it,
Right.
which is exactly what happened to him. Now, it's the only story in the Chumash ever that was that we have the birth of kids. Yaakov and Esau.
Okay.
Only story ever.
Right.
And if you're translating the switching of hands into right and left, so if you look at brothers, young versus old, it's always the youngest that gets the scene.
Right. Okay. So you bring up a point that often we find, especially in the book of Bereshis, the younger brother seems to have the stronger energy than the older one. Moshe and Aaron is another example. Yosef and Reuben. Okay. Let's put that on hold for now. Right. Yitzchak and Yishmael. Correct. The younger, I don't think younger is associated with left, but in this situation, you're saying that would be the way to give the blessing. Fine. Good. That's a good point. But let's go. Yes. One more question because I want to cover a little bit more ground today.
I don't really understand how the explanation works if the exact wording says, and the accuser was standing by his right, meaning by Yeshua's right side.
No. So the way we understand it, the way it's understood to be is that he stood the way I was looking at him. If I am looking at you and I see something to what to me is your right hand side is really your left hand
I
side.
understand, but like, what was the exact wording? If it's saying by his right.
I know, but the wording is vayar'eni. The key word is the first. It was about the way I saw it. The first word is the way I saw it, not the way it was, the way I saw it. All right, very good. So now the Gemara says, so he said, so now continuing in the story. So the three people are thrown in. Only one survives, which is Yeshua the Kohen Gadol. Amar lei. So Nebuchadnezzar, who's the one who's watching all this, says to Yeshua, Yadana the Tzadika. So I know that you're a righteous person, which is why you were saved. Elamai time ahanya b'chpurtanura. But why were your clothing burnt? He says, if you're righteous, not only you should have been saved, your clothing also should have been saved. After all, he said, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, the three people who I previously threw in the fire, lo ahanya b'klal, were not burnt at all, not them, not their clothing. So why did you not merit the same miracle they did? Amar lei, to which he responded, to which Yochanan responded, Inut la sahava v'anachada. He said, they were three, I'm only one. Again, somehow the power of three protected them more than me. To which Nebuchadnezzar responded. Amar lei said, no, that doesn't work. Avram Yachid Hava. Who else in Judaism was thrown into fire is Avram Avinu. We have the story of Avram thrown into the fire before we even get to know him, really. We say that when he left Ur Kasdim, he was thrown into fire by whom? Nimrod. And he was spared. And we find that he was totally spared, him and his clothing. Apparently Nebuchadnezzar knew that. So he says, Hasam lo avrashayim adeh. He says there's a difference. When Avram was thrown into the fire, he was thrown in by himself. By me, I was thrown in with two wicked people. So I was saved, but their negative energy affected me. Once when Avram was thrown in, the fire was given no power, and no power. It was as if the fire was powerless. But in my situation, I had wicked people alongside me. And so the fire, so to say, had permission to do damage, right? It had permission to do damage. It's almost an interesting terminology that when fire causes damage, exactly, you have to be careful who you hang out with. Thank God we're hanging out over here with all sorts of holy people, both virtually and in person. He said, because the fire was given permission to do damage. So therefore, it didn't take my life, but it certainly did the damage on my clothing. V'hainu de'amri inshi. He says, and that's what it means when people say the following analogy. Trei ude yabishe, v'chad retiva. If you have two, again, ude, I guess it was twigs. If you have two dry twigs and one wet, or two dry logs of two dry logs, those who put together bonfires will appreciate this. Trei ude yabishe. If you have two dry logs, v'chad retiva, and one wet log. Uktan yabishe l'retiva. Now, if you put the wet log on its own, try to kindle it, it's not going to work. But if you put two dry logs alongside the wet log, it'll slowly cause the wet log also to cause fire. And he says he uses it as an analogy. Those two were the dry logs who instantly burnt. I'm the wet log, which wasn't supposed to burn, but you put me next to the dry logs, so it didn't burn me, but at least I got singed. That was his way. And as Sadia said, the idea behind it is your neighbor, the people you hang out with. So even though it may not affect, it's something very profound over here, which is that on the one hand, he wasn't killed, but he was singed. His clothing were burnt, symbolizing that if you are holy, all right, you'll probably do the right things. But the people that are around you are going to influence you. Even if you're a good person with a good heart and good mind, good intent, the people around you will influence you. And that was his answer. You want to know why my clothing were burnt? Because you put me next to wicked people. So I survived, but my clothing did not. That was his answer. What do you mean? He's not, no, the fact of the matter is he was saved. But it's saying that the people he was around affected him to a degree. And it wasn't even his choice. He didn't choose to go into the fire at all. Right, there's nothing you can do about it. Says the Gemara, but the Gemara says even that answer that he gave was not the real answer. You know, he was, as the Gemara says, he was trying to just appease, give an answer to Nebuchadnezzar. What was the real reason why was he punished to some degree? My time, the Gemara says, what's the real reason that he didn't experience the miracle that Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah did? Papa said, Shahayu banav nosim nashim she'enan hagunas l'kuhuna. Because his children were marrying people who were not worthy of the kahuna. He was a Kohen Gadol, which means his children were the sons of the Kohen Gadol, and they should have married people of righteousness, and they weren't. They were marrying people who were not righteous. V'lo micha bahen, and he did not rebuke them. Today, you have all the time young men and women tell their parents, stay out of it. I'm going to find whoever I want to marry who's right for me, and you just stay out of it. And Yeshua probably listened to his kids. They said, stay out of it. And he stayed out of it. Because of that, he was punished. Because they married people they shouldn't have married, the Gemara says. They married people who were unworthy. Remember, it's the family of the Kohen Gadol. It's supposed to be the most righteous family of the Jewish people. And they didn't, and he didn't get involved and try to dissuade them from those people, from marrying those people. And that's why his clothing was punished. Yes.
So, it's his sin that he didn't dissuade them.
It is his sin that he didn't dissuade them. Yes. When you say sin is a broad term. Sin doesn't mean that that it's one of the 613 commandments. But yes,
think of like curses where like this person's progeny is going to be affected negatively because of his actions. But like to me, that always let's spell this out very simply. Most of us here, some of us have children who are married or married off children. Many of us don't. Maybe we should leave this to the parents over here who have married children. What's the rule when it comes to your child's dating life? Are you supposed to get involved or not get involved? Is it something you're supposed to stay out of? Some people say,
I got the answer. I got the answer. You don't get involved, but you raise them, right? You basically spend 20-something years raising them properly, so you don't need.
You raise them properly, so you don't have to get involved, so they make the right choices on their own. All right, but you see, the Gemara here seems to say no, that he should have gotten involved and said to his children, "This is not the person you should be dating." I don't know. That's what the Gemara says. Yes.
How is this Yeshua, the same person who tried to case didn't tell anything to his children?
I guess not. He felt that their choice when it comes to marriage is their choice, And that's why, but you see, it's not considered a very harsh sin. It was almost like the clothing was singed. In fact, this is where the Gemara continues this, because we find the pasuk continuing in that same prophecy about this Yehoshua. He's going back to Zechariah. Zechariah, we said verse number 1 and 2, I saw Yehoshua. Then he says, Yehoshua was wearing dirty clothing. Says the Gemara, why would he be wearing, he's a Kohen Gadol. Why would the Kohen Gadol be wearing dirty clothes? And why would the prophet mention that? He says, rather, what it means is, it's saying, Begadim Tzoim, and he didn't stop them. Begadim Tzoim is symbolic. One of the ways which differentiated the Kohen or the Kohen Gadol from everyone else was what? Clothing. That's what we learned in this week's Torah portion. It's all about the clothing. The idea that he was wearing, that his clothing were dirty was more of a metaphor for the idea that his kahuna, the clothing which symbolized the high priesthood that he was dirty. He wasn't stopping the children who should have been the next generation of Kohen Gadol. He should have been more demanding of them in their decision making, even when it came to marriage. Yes, let's take a couple more, because I still want the question I posed in the text. I haven't even gotten to. We're not even close to it.
Didn't we say in the last tomorrow that there was specifically something about three people dressing up in their finest clothes?
Last week we said, I'm just repeating it. Last week we said that Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah dressed in their fine clothing when they were thrown into the fire.
So is it possible that he didn't dress in his best clothing?
So maybe this is saying in contrast to Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, who dressed up with their clothing. He was wearing dirty clothing. Could be. But that's an very interesting observation. But the Gemara deduces something else. It says the dirty clothing over here, because dirty clothing was a metaphor for the clothing of kahuna, which he did not stop from being dirty, not by himself, by the next generation. Let's get quick question. Yes.
His choice not to get involved in this progeny is marrying off. That affect their kahuna.
Yeah, I don't believe it practically mattered, because at that point the temple was destroyed. But so there was no Kohen Gadol. Right. So we'll get to that later. But in the meantime, this was why the Gemara says that's the real reason his clothing were burnt in the fire, even though he survived, was because he didn't protect the legacy of the clothing, which is the legacy of the Kohen Gadol. We only have a few minutes, so I want to jump. I'm going to skip a couple of the Gemaras which I had hoped to get to. And instead, I'll get to that Gemara, which says as follows. The Gemara, and now I'm going to go to the bottom. For those of you who are following inside, I'm jumping now quite a bit to the bottom of 93b, the very bottom of 93b. And over here, it's talking about Daniel, all within the same era. The Daniel, the great Daniel, and Daniel's relationship with Nehemiah, as well as Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. They all live at the same time. These are the great leaders of Jewish people at the same time. And yet, the Gemara says over here that Daniel was holier than all of the others. Daniel had a certain elevation, was more spiritual than the others. How do we know that? So Gemara shares the following. All this comes from the prophecy. This is from the book of Daniel, chapter 10, verse number 7. So over here, we're talking about Daniel describing a prophecy, that he saw something. He saw a godly image, an angel of God. And here's what it says. The pasuk says, and you can check this up if you'd like, the book of Daniel, chapter 10, verse number 7. Says Daniel, Daniel says, and I saw, behold, Daniel saw, Levadi es Hamara. I alone saw this vision. However, the people who were standing with me, I was walking with a group of people, I saw the angel. The people standing next to me did not see the angel. Loiro es Hamara. They did not see the angel. So from here, the Talmud deduces that Daniel was holier than the others, because he was able to see the angel. He was able to see something that the others could not see. But then he goes on to say, even though the others who were with me did not see the angel, aval charada gedola nafla alehem. However, they were overcome by fear, Vayivrechu mehechave, and they actually ran away out of fear. So I'm walking with several other people. I see an angel standing in front of me. The people next to me don't see it, but they feel fear, and they're so frightened that they run, despite not understanding why they're afraid. I understood their fear; they didn't understand their fear. Says the Gemara. We'll get back to this in a moment. Says the Gemara, the people who were with me did not see this. Says the Gemara, who are those people? Who are those people? Rabbi Yirmiyah said, some say it was that these people are Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. The three prophets. These are considered to be the three final prophets of Israel. Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. Those are the people walking with Daniel. Yet Daniel sees it, they don't see it. So from here we learn, says Gemara, so therefore from here we see that Daniel is the greater of the prophets, or the greater of them, that he was able to see what they couldn't see. I'm going to jump a couple lines, and the Gemara asks asks what seems to be a pretty simple question. If they didn't see the angel, my time so why are they afraid? Why are you afraid if you don't see anything? It's one thing if you see something, they didn't see it, so why would they be afraid? Says the Gemara, and here is a very, very interesting idea, which is quoted often. Says Gemara, even though they indeed did not see anything, mazalayhu chazi, their mazel saw it. What does that mean? Mazel is a familiar word. What does it mean? The literal translation of Gemara is, even though they didn't see it, their mazel saw it. Try telling that to someone today. You don't see it, but your mazel sees it. What's that? Mazel. We think of mazel tov. Good luck or congratulations. So some of you have mazel, right? That even though they didn't see it, their guardian angel saw it. But they were personally afraid. The guardian angel wasn't afraid; they were afraid. So this teaches. It's interesting because we're learning Gemara. We're not learning Kabbalah, but the Gemara here is sharing a pretty mystical idea, and that is that you have. Today, we're even somewhat familiar with this because of where psychology has developed the idea of the subconscious. So today's self-understood, there's subconscious. Today we have this idea, right? A person can go into an elevator and go up to a very high floor, and suddenly they're afraid. You don't know why you're afraid. You're afraid of heights or whatever. You don't know why. And today, psychologists will tell you the reason why you're afraid of heights, maybe because of some sort of episode that took place in your childhood or something. We can have fears because of things that took place previously in life. In other words, we can have fears which we can't really explain. And over here, the Gemara is saying is that a person has a spiritual subconscious, and that your spiritual subconscious sees things which you don't physically see. But that when the spiritual subconscious sees something that you don't see, you become very realistically afraid. That's what the Gemara is saying. That a person has a mazel, and therefore you may have a certain feeling right now which you can't explain. That's because there's a part of you which sees something which you can't really consciously explain, but subconsciously there's something being seen right now which is frightening. Therefore, the Gemara continues. Omar Ravina, says Ravina the following. Shma mina. From here we could learn the following rule. Hi, man. This is what I posted as the question was, what do you do if you have the onset of unexplicable anxiety, sudden fear? So what should you do in a situation of sudden fear? Well, the Gemara answers that question. Hi, man demivis, a person who feels sudden fear. What should you do? You should assume that what's going on is that that even though I don't understand what's taking place with my fear, I don't see anything wrong. But my mazel may be seeing something. Maybe what you call guardian angel, or my mazel, my spiritual subconscious, sees something which is a little bit frightening. I don't mean to scare people into thinking that, all sorts of horrible things are taking place around you. But the Gemara is saying that maybe if you see something and suddenly you feel fear, it could be that there is a spiritually frightening entity right now, which your mazel sees. Umay takante. So what's the solution? Great. So now I know what the problem is. What's the solution? My takante, he says, Linshov miduchte arba garmidi. One thing you should do is move 4 cubits away from where you're standing. So move away 4 cubits is approximately 6 to 8 feet. Maybe right now, you walk into shul and you're sitting in someone's seat and they're not happy. Maybe you're sitting in someone's, like, there's a spiritual entity that you're bothering. So just go 6 feet away. That's the first thing you should do. Inami. Another suggestion is likre kriya shema. Say the kriya shema. Say the shema at night. That kriya shema, or not at night, I'm saying the kriya shema has a certain protective energy. So even if there's some sort of spiritual energy which is dangerous, the kriya shema will protect you. I remember one of my early childhood memories, as a little child, and I had a friend over. I don't know, we must have been 5, 6 years old, 7 years old, and something convinced us, without a doubt, that there was a monster in the closet. I mean, we were there, and there was no doubt in our minds. I know exactly. I still remember this friend, monster in the closet. So what do we do? How do we protect ourselves? We took turns. One of us would be in bed, the other one would stand by the mezuzah and kiss the mezuzah the whole time to protect us. So it says, if you are in a situation where you have this fear, you should say Kriya Shema. So the first thing it says, get out of the way. The other thing it says is say Kriya Shema. V'imkai. Now, what about in a situation where you can't say Kriya Shema? Where can you not say Kriya Shema? V'imkai bimkom hatinofes. What if you're in a place, a bathroom, or a place where it's very dirty? You're not allowed to say Kriya Shema there. So what should you do? Here's a suggestion. Lema hachi. This is what you should announce. Say the following, and it's in Aramaic, but we'll translate. Iza bebeitabcha shmeina minoi. Sadia, how does it translate over there? The goat in the butcher shop is fatter than I am. That's the statement. I would say, don't bother me. There's better merchandise elsewhere for you to bother. And that is the Iza de Beshmei de Betalcha Shmeina Meinai. And that would perhaps be an Aramaic saying for basically stop bothering me. Whatever power, whatever energy here there is that's bothering me, just lay off, go bother someone else. So well, that will conclude. I'm not sure how serious it takes. Not how serious isn't. It's not true. I'm not sure how much to let it interfere with our lives. Some people may be neurotic and can read this Gemara and live in fear. That's not the goal over here. The goal, though, is that there is certain realities which take place around us which may not be familiar. That's positive and negative. We live in a world, we have our senses, and our senses pick up certain truths. We're limited, exactly, but we're limited. And you should know that there's more than the eye can see that takes place. There's idea of energy that is conveyed, and we can create positive energy. We can create positive spiritual energy. We can create negative spiritual energy. This idea, which we're sharing here, exists in many levels of Judaism, and that is that we have powers beyond what we typically think, and we have the ability to create a positive energy for others and for ourselves. And that is the idea that I think we should walk away with from this Gemara, is that the world is not as simple as it seems. And but with the power of the Shema, we can protect ourselves from anything. All right, well, that will conclude. We'll continue, God willing, this same tractate next week. Okay.